What's up, guys? So today we're going to be talking about David Pakman. I've been watching David pretty regularly for about 1 to 2 months. He's a really sharp guy. I'll show you what's he about. He's a progressive talk show host. I think he used to be known largely for his radio show, but he broadcasts his shows live on YouTube, and so now you can see those videos for yourself, so you don't have to listen to the radio at all. He also takes call-ins, so that's really entertaining to listen to. David refers to himself on his program as a social democrat, so that's someone that's almost as far left as democratic socialists, but with the caveat that he doesn't actually want socialism, supposedly. I'm not really clear on what the exact difference is, but nominally he doesn't want socialism, and social democrats, generally speaking, don't want that. So, what do we want to look at with David Pakman? Well, David's a really smart guy. He's, I think, actually more well-spoken than Ben Shapiro. They're roughly on the same level there. But just as Ben Shapiro destroys college students by, he'll go to a college campus, give a speech, then he'll take questions from the crowd. And I can't say that Ben has prepared his answer to these random questions from the students. They're so often on topics that Ben really knows about that he can kind of pwn them because Ben speaks fast, he is smart, he studied the topic, he's generally well informed, and it's a college student. They just get their ass kicked. Well, David likes to interview often controversial people, which you can say whether that's good or bad for yourself, but he'll ask them a lot of questions that, as you'll see, are intended to trip them up, to make them look bad, or just the question in and of itself is an accusation. So, all that being said, let's get into the first example with Ben Shapiro.
And that's really, I think, the problem we have to focus on, right?
It's not all Americans. I think that we have to distinguish between groups. It's easy to say, all of America has a gun violence problem, but it's also not true, right? New Hampshire and Vermont do not have a gun violence problem. Chicago does have a gun violence problem. Washington, D.C. has a gun violence problem. Big cities that are heavily populated across the United States seem to have much more of a gun problem than more rural areas, even if the gun ownership rate is higher in the rural areas. So we have to be looking at solutions that will actually work. And the truth is that broadly tailored solution, it's possible there's a different solution for Chicago than there is for Montana. But I think that we have to be as careful and meticulous in crafting solutions as we can.
So my concern when you said that before was we may need to craft solutions that are tailored for each culture. It starts to border. That could be interpreted as saying it needs to be determined by race, potentially. Along what lines? Explain more, because I don't want you to be accused of that if that's not what you mean.
So Pakman just implied that what Shapiro said is about race. But I'll provide the link to the whole video. Shapiro doesn't mention race. And Pakman doesn't even reference a person or a group of people that has or would say something like that about what Shapiro is saying. So it's not really reasonable in any sense of the word. There's no reason to say people are accusing Shapiro of making a racial statement about the differences between gun violence in rural areas and in cities. That's not reasonable. And in and of itself, that question is an accusation that maybe Ben is thinking about race when he says that. What Shapiro did say is that there's cultural differences leading to a differing frequency of gun violence in cities and rural areas. And he mentioned, I think his exact words were, it's possible there might be a different solution for Chicago and Montana. And of course, that's not actually an apples-to-apples comparison. If you want an apples-to-apples comparison, Chicago is a city about 2.7 million people. The largest city in Montana is Billings with less than 200,000. Montana is a very sparsely populated, largely rural state. Obviously, Illinois is very centered on Chicago, which is one of the largest cities in America. Very urban state, relatively speaking. It's totally reasonable to say that there's cultural differences between cities and rural areas. If you want to just figure out whether I'm right about that really quickly, just go look at which areas in the United States, look at a political map of the United States, and look at which states are red, predominantly Republican, and which areas of states, if you want to look at a county level map, which ones are blue. It's the cities that are blue, Democrat, the rural areas that are red, Republican. Duh. Yeah, they're culturally different in many ways. As for gun violence, there's more petty crime per capita in cities, just because there's more opportunity for petty crime. There's also per capita more organized crime. if this, it should be obvious to you, but if it's not obvious, this is because the organized crime syndicates tend to revolve around illegal drugs or something else that's illegal, usually products, occasionally services like prostitution, for example. Um, Obviously, there is more organized crime per capita because there's no reason for a, a sex trader, someone who transports and sells or uses sex slaves for services, there's no reason they would go to this or that random small town. There's barely a market there. Why would you go sell heroin in Smallsville, Ohio, as opposed to Chicago, Illinois? It's just far easier to find clients if you're selling drugs or whatever. So naturally, the violence that comes along with organized crime, which frankly is largely different groups of criminals, different gangs or subgroups of gangs fighting each other for resources or for turf or whatever, that's why there is per capita more violent crime, including gun crime in cities. Um, Now, what exactly Shapiro means by cultural differences is definitely pretty vague. If you want to watch the whole interview, I don't think that Shapiro gave a very fleshed out description of what he means by cultural differences, but it is factually true that there's massive cultural differences between urban and rural areas, and it's definitely true that per capita there's more gun violence in cities for the reasons I've already explained and perhaps some others that I haven't even conceived of. Let's move on to our second example, the interview with James Damore.
To be able to explore that, like, why wouldn't we want to know if indeed there is something biological that makes men or women predisposed to excel or struggle in certain areas? But to take one of the things you just said, this idea that in countries where men and women are treated more similarly, you see larger gaps in some of these areas. I did quite a bit of research over the last week, and what I found was that the more egalitarian a society is, the smaller the gender differences become in terms of performance in science and math. So, in other words, when one example would be a Villanova University psych department study called Cross-National Patterns of Gender Differences in Mathematics, what they found that was when women were most secure and affirmed, that the difference between their performance in math and science and that of men almost goes away completely. And that seems to be at odds with what you said.
No, so I'm not really interested in the actual ability of men and women. It's more the personality. And in those societies, the personality is what diverges the most. And so a lot of the reason why there's a gap in STEM is not that women are necessarily worse in math or science. You know, women are actually doing better than men in pretty much every field in schooling. But they just choose to go into different fields at some point. And you know, one of the largest reasons why there are fewer women in these STEM fields is that yes, men and women have about the same quantitative ability on average, but women tend to have higher verbal ability. And especially among high performers, men are much more likely to be only good at math and quantitative things and not so good at verbal, while women are more likely to be well balanced. And if you're well balanced, then you don't need to work in STEM. You can work in law or other fields that require verbal ability, while the men really just need to work in STEM.
So, David, intentionally or not, misrepresents James Damore's point about how there's a higher proportion of all women in the workforce. There's a higher or a lower proportion of women represented in STEM professions as opposed to other professions. And James, what David's claiming, what he's responding to, is this claim that somebody has made that men are better at mathematics, which is integral to all STEM professions. Therefore, this is why there's more men in the profession, because there's fewer women who are qualified to get these jobs, because women must be worse at mathematics. Well, I'm sure there's people who have claimed that before. I think there was even a famous Barbie at one point that said, like, math is hard. I'm sure that that stereotype exists. But David is not out here battling America's stereotypes. He's having an interview with James Damore. Go and read James Damore's memo. I provided a link in the description. He never says that. Read through the whole damn memo. If you're interested. He never claims that women are worse at mathematics, that men are better, whatever. What James claims, and what he clarified in that video, that clip I just gave you, is that women, because there are women who are just like men who are interested in non-STEM professions, professions that rely more on verbal or abilities other than mathematics, and because women on average perform better than men in these areas, they have a greater ability, women on average have a greater ability to get jobs in non-STEM roles because they are actually, whether it's naturally more talented or whatever, they're more skilled. And this is what James says in his memo, it's what he says in his interview. He never claims, to my knowledge, and certainly not in the memo, he did not claim that women are worse at mathematics, therefore you would expect more men in mathematics-related professions. That the most charitable interpretation I can give of David responding to something that James has clearly not claimed and is totally misinterpreting what James said, because we know David's had time to prepare for this interview, so it's not like he doesn't know the content of the memo. It's not like he's unfamiliar with it. The most charitable interpretation I can give of this issue that David's having is that maybe he chose not to properly review the memo, relied off of the criticisms that certain media outlets have made out of James Damore, painting him as a sexist. I think Vox did an article on why all the science in James Damore's memo is wrong, even though it's legitimate science. Maybe David was just under the impression that James really did believe that women are worse than men at mathematics, and David was trying to attack this truly false conception. Women are not worse than men at mathematics, and maybe David was just trying to downplay that. But the nicest thing I can say is that this wasn't the appropriate venue for it, because James has not, to my knowledge, and did not in his memo, make that claim. Totally disingenuous of David. Alright, so let's get to example number 3. Probably my favorite. The Richard Spencer interview. Now I'll say up front that as opposed to David's participation in the Ben Shapiro and James Damore interviews, I think that his interview with Richard Spencer is really good. I don't like Richard Spencer. White supremacy, even white nationalism are stupid ideas. And David asked a number of good questions that actually elicited answers from Richard Spencer that showed, I mean, really the main thing is how do you establish a white white ethno-state, as Richard Spencer calls it. And of course, Richard Spencer didn't have an answer to that question. There is never an answer, because the answer is either exporting everybody that's not white, and how do we decide who's white? Well, whatever, we're just going to be extremely specific and arbitrary. Oh, are Persians white? Maybe or maybe not. It's complete nonsense. Or the other answer is, well, it was just never going to happen, so I'm full of shit. It really is a nonsense ideology, and David did a good job with this interview, generally speaking. He did resort to some of his usual asking gotcha questions to try and trip up Richard Spencer. And like, there's one question about, didn't you date an Asian girl 10 years ago, back when Richard Spencer was not a white nationalist? And Spencer handles it pretty well. Yes, I did not have that ideology at that time, so it was not against my ideology to date an Asian woman. Now I don't do that, and so on. But David did a good job of achieving what I think is his political objective, which is essentially to make Richard Spencer look bad. That all being said, there is one extremely disturbing, actually, statement that David made that, honest to God, it's so disturbing. So let's watch the clip.
You were at the inauguration. When Trump says stuff like America First, for example, which is a slogan that the Anti-Defamation League has suggested he not use because of its references to anti-Semitic context in which it was previously used, etc. I mean, do you like hearing stuff like that from Trump?
Yes, I do. But it's a complicated matter. First off, America First was not an anti-Semitic group at all. There was a group called America First that opposed the United States entrance into the Second World War.
Yes, but on the basis that it was Jewish interests trying to pull the United States in for their own benefit. I mean, it was fundamentally anti-Semitic at its core.
It was not fundamentally anti-Semitic. I mean, we might just disagree with the
historical
interpretation here, but It was not fundamentally anti-Semitic. The acknowledgement that Jews have interest, that is not fundamentally anti-Semitic. I acknowledge that Cubans have interest. It's just being realistic.
America First not wanting to intervene in the Holocaust is anti-Semitic. What a statement. I am not super familiar with every piece of rhetoric that has ever been said by a member of America First. But from what David has described here, and Richard together, they work together to tell us what it is. It's a political activist group that worked to try and keep the United States from intervening in the Holocaust, which of course meant a military intervention that claimed the lives of tens of millions of Americans. They tried to prevent our intervention because it seemed to serve the interests of Jewish groups. I don't see why that's anti-Semitic at all. I think that's a completely nonsensical viewpoint. Yes, of course, Jewish groups of any sort and size, being as they're ethnically and perhaps religiously Jewish, have a special degree of care and consideration about Jews. I'm a human being. I understand that. Humans do tend to sympathize more with people who are similar to us. Totally get it. But the simple fact that Jewish groups were at that point in time trying to get the United States to intervene in the Holocaust, to intervene in World War II, does not necessarily mean that it is in the interest of Americans to do so. And keep in mind that our intervention in the Holocaust wasn't saying, hey guys, please stop doing this. It was us and other countries deploying over 100,000 of our, if we're really talking about young men who have barely experienced their life, men who were drafted, by the way, they didn't have a choice to do it, and going and fighting a bloody conflict, killing other people who were largely other young men from these countries who are also not bad people, killing them, being maimed and killed themselves. And sure, it was in pursuit of a good objective. I am glad, as someone who didn't have that responsibility, who didn't face that risk and that disturbing PTSD and everything else that goes along with war, I'm glad that we did it because I think it was the right thing to do. I don't think it's anti-Semitic to not want to help. But this logic of this group of people really needs help. I'm aware of the problem and I choose not to help them. Therefore, I am anti that group. Absolutely ridiculous logic. Let's pull up a picture of David Pakman. That's a slick-looking guy right there. Look at that. He's got a nice button-up shirt that looks comfy. I'm sure that costs at least $30. He's got a blazer on too. What a smart dress, man. I think that just looking at this picture alone and also being aware that David, he does make money off of some of his YouTube videos. He has sponsorships. You'll see many of his videos. It's not an advertisement on top of the video, but in the video itself, he will sell you a product and so on. David makes plenty of money. I'm sure that David is at least defined as upper middle class. I'm not going to pretend to guess his exact net worth, but suffice to say, I have a lot less money than David Pakman. And yet I still make a small financial contribution to a homeless shelter in my home state of North Carolina. Do you know why I do that? Because American homeless people have horrible lives on average. The life expectancy for an American homeless person is more than 10 years lower than the average Americans. They're at a much heightened risk of police brutality. They have a vastly elevated risk of being a victim of any kind of physical crime, whether it's a violent crime, whether it's just a mugging, whether it's being maimed, aggravated assault, murdered, raped, whatever. I could go on, but homeless people literally die as a result of the circumstances they experience every day in the United States. It is one of the great shames of our society today. And not only is it a problem, the problem is getting worse. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, the number of homeless people is actually increasing year to year. Now, looking at David, obviously David could be putting more of his financial resources to helping homeless people. Obviously David is required to wear clothing, I'm sure, to meet some sort of content guidelines on YouTube, but he could be wearing a wife beater. He could be wearing a Hanes crewneck undershirt. Oops, product placement. And sell his clothes off and donate that money to a homeless shelter. David has enough money and certainly the business smarts to run a homeless shelter himself. He could do that, but instead he'd rather, ask gotcha questions of Richard Spencer on the internet. That's how David Pakman chooses to spend his time. Clearly, David Pakman could be putting far more of his time and resources into helping homeless people. And not only that, He's talking about, oh, it's anti-Semitic to not send tens of thousands, over 100,000 American young men into deadly circumstances. I'm not saying that David Pakman needs to pick up a gun and go kill people and be shot and killed to help homeless people. I'm saying, yeah, maybe just donate a little bit more of your financial resources to helping homeless people. Clearly, David Pakman is not putting his best effort into helping the homeless people in his own society. But it's anti-Semitic to not want to intervene in the Holocaust because it's not in the interests of Americans in general. That's not anti-Semitic. By that logic, I mean, to use David's word, he really likes to use this, it's a disaster. It's a completely nonsensical viewpoint. By that logic, every single group that David is aware of, which is experiencing a problem, for example, the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, nope, David is anti-Sudanese people. He doesn't want to help them. He doesn't care about them. It's complete bullshit. You, the person who's listening, you're aware of all sorts of problems that people near you or far from you are experiencing them. Apparently, by David's logic, by knowingly and actively opposing helping them because of whatever your reasons are, oh, it's just not in my self-interest to help them, you are anti that person who needs help. You are anti that group of people who needs help. Honestly, God, I think this is just some sort of blinder that David has on. He's openly identified himself as a Jewish man. I'm sure that he has some very strong feelings, even stronger than myself. I'm not Jewish. I'm sure that he has some stronger feelings about the Holocaust even than I do, even than you non-Jewish viewers might have. I understand that. It's not an excuse for labeling people who want to act in their own self-interests as anti-Semitic, David. I think you can do better than that. So I think that about wraps up the video. I've watched a lot more David Pakman videos, whether interviews or otherwise, than this. And yes, there are more examples of this kind of behavior. If David sees this video, honestly, dude, you're a very smart person, and I enjoy watching your content, and I won't deny, I do get a laugh sometimes. I laughed at that when you tripped up Richard Spencer about the Asian girlfriend thing. I think it was disingenuous of you, he wasn't a white nationalist at that point in time. But regardless, it was funny. You're a very smart person, and I think that you actually are a force for good, generally speaking, but it really hurts you when you get through an interview with Richard Spencer. You ask a bunch of these gotcha questions. You ask questions that are designed to make him look bad when you already know the answer, will you denounce Hitler? Yes, he should have denounced Hitler. Me personally, I denounce Hitler. It's an easy thing to do. But you already knew the answer to that question. You admitted that you knew the answer to that question. So that was only designed to make Richard Spencer look bad. Richard Spencer treated you better in that interview than you treated him. And that's pretty sad, because I don't think you're a despicable person. I think that Richard Spencer's viewpoints are generally pretty despicable, but he behaved better than you did in that interview. You gotta do better than that, dude. I mean, it's sad. If you can't be better than Richard Spencer, or at least on his level of civility, that says something very poor about you and the people associated with you. You asked him also to denounce the KKK, and he wouldn't, and naturally members of the KKK are, regardless of whether they engage in lynching black people or something disgusting and disturbing of the sort, they are associated with other members of the KKK who have done those awful things. Well, guess what? Other people who are members of your movement, or like the Social Democrats, are associated with the things that you do. And this is very poor behavior. It makes you look petty, and it makes you look like you're just trying to get cheap shots in these interviews instead of trying to accomplish something productive for your audience. So that's all I have to say to you, David, and everybody else. I hope this was informative, like I always say. If you got something to say, please put it in the comments. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.